Hello, YouTube. Welcome back to my channel, Against the State. For those of you who are new here, what I do is basically social commentary. I talk about economics, politics, and I like to address claims that other people are making and then do a little evaluation on them, bring up the data. So, this is an interview between Gary of Gary Economics and Owen Jones, two leftist YouTubers. So the first thing to bring up is the media turmoil that surrounded Liz Truss's tax cut plan.
Tories tried to cut taxes on the rich, but instead of the left getting out their champagne and popping them if they can afford them in the current cost of living crisis, people might go, well, yeah, fine, but if a left-wing government in the current context tried to do, for example, increasing public spending on the things we care about, same thing's going to happen.
So the first thing I want to point out is that right now the deficit in the UK is 120 billion pounds sterling. That's 4.4% of GDP. That's for the 2023 and 2024 fiscal year. Now, as you can see from this chart, this isn't exactly unprecedented, but it's still pretty high, historically speaking. And the forecast is for a similar budget for the coming year. I think the reaction to the Truss budget cut is emblematic of the problems with the modern conservative approach, which is cut taxes but don't cut spending in any meaningful way. That's what happened during the Reagan administration. Reagan doubled the deficit. And actually, the vaunted Reagan tax cuts were pretty marginal. While he did reduce the top rates, he also eliminated a lot of tax deductions, simplifying the tax code. So a lot of people ended up paying higher taxes than they did previously. If you look at tax revenues under Reagan, it's not like they decreased by any meaningful amount. At the same time, he ran up military spending, even spending on the Department of Education. So the problem wasn't that the Truss government wanted to cut taxes. Tax cuts are a good way to grow the economy. The problem is they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to cut taxes without cutting spending. And I guess the idea is that the tax cuts are going to grow the economy, which is going to grow tax revenue. You don't have to really worry about it. But the problem is when you're running $100 billion deficits, what you're really doing is financing these tax cuts by printing money. And the ensuing inflation is going to have some severe effects on the economy. Furthermore, whatever the government spends, taxpayers pay, whether they pay for it via taxation or whether they pay for it from inflation. Inflation is fundamentally a tax in the sense that it's a transfer of wealth from private citizens, businesses, anybody who's got a cash balance to the government. The government, the central bank, creates money, uses it to buy government bonds, essentially lending money to the government. So the money's created out of thin air, lent to the government, and the problem with financing government spending this way is that it's a tax, but it's not a tax applied to income, like with the income tax. It's a tax by anybody who's saved money. As much as I hate the income tax, there is a certain logic to it in that the people who make the most, the people who are most able to pay the burden are the ones who are taxed. But with inflation, you're taxing whoever saved the most, regardless of their income or their wealth. So not only is it capricious, it's also penalizing fundamentally healthy economic activity, aka savings. So the problem with the trust plan wasn't that they wanted to cut taxes. Absolutely, the UK could use massive tax cuts. I mean, they have ridiculously high levels of government spending. The top marginal tax rate for the income tax is very high, but what you really need is spending cuts that not only accompany but actually surpass the amount of tax cuts that you have. And the problem is that very few governments have the political will or indeed the political capital to cut spending when there's so many interest groups that advocate for it and not a really strong ideological opposition against it. So, the next part of the conversation, they invoke the specter of austerity. So, austerity, which can also be called deficit hawkism, is either spending cuts or tax increases that are aimed at reducing the deficit and or the debt. So I am very much in favor of cuts to government spending. However, I am not at all in favor of raising taxes in order to eliminate the deficit. That, I think, is completely the wrong approach. You can see that government spending as a percentage of GDP is essentially at a peak. It's been trending onwards throughout the 20th century, peaks and valleys, but there's a pretty clear trend here of increasing government spending as a percentage of GDP. Why is this a problem? Well, there's a certain amount of production in the economy every year. And the more of that goes to government expenditures on healthcare, education, social transfers, the less that can be reinvested in the economy in the form of new capital, factories being built, machinery being added to workplaces. And that's going to translate into slower economic growth and less prosperity. I'm of the opinion that people are better off spending their own money on themselves than having a government bureaucrat tax them and then spend it on their behalf. Whenever you have the government involved in something, it becomes inefficient and wasteful. When a consumer spends money, especially most people who are constrained by relatively strict budgets, they're constantly looking for the best deal, doing comparison shopping, uh, just generally being very careful about how they spend their money. But that's not the case with government. And when you get to this point where government spending is 45% of GDP, you can't tell me they're just taxing the rich. They're taxing everybody. They're taxing the middle class hard at that point. So you got to cut spending. You got to look at privatization of state services. You have to look at reducing the size and scope of the state, and you have to make some hard political choices. The one interesting aspect of the components of UK government spending is this dramatic increase in general public services, which I don't know what that is. I'm assuming it's administration. Oh, excuse me. That's the debt service charge is why that's jumped up. At least they're not spending too much money on the military. But when you have such high levels of government spending, that's just taking too much wealth out of the private sector and basically just slowing down economic progress and economic development. So they don't like austerity. What is Gary Economics' solution?
There's basically very little discussion of should we tax rich people more. And this is in the context context of in the last 3 years, the biggest and fastest ever increase in wealth by millionaires and billionaires in this country, the biggest and fastest ever increase in inequality. So in the last 3 years, the government's given out £600 million. That would be £12,000 for every adult in the country. But it's gone almost exclusively to richer people. They are still sitting on that money. If we were to tax rich people, we could take that money back, we could redistribute it, we could give a massive cash injection to ordinary people, and this problem would be over. But at the moment, the debate is being framed simply around spending. No.
So Gary's solution is to tax wealth. This isn't exactly a novel solution. A lot of countries have tried wealth taxes. In fact, Colombia, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland currently do tax wealth. Switzerland, really, they normally have a better handle on economic policy. So what's wrong with wealth taxes? Well, in the first place, they do not collect a lot of money. They're extremely expensive to implement and maintain. And naturally, wealthy people have fled countries that impose wealth taxes. And it's not just rich people leaving your country. You also have to consider rich people that might want to come to your country that decide not to because of the wealth tax. Or if there was a rich person who was sort of on the fence about emigrating or not, this might push them over the edge. German and Dutch courts found the wealth tax unconstitutional. And if you look at Spain, the combination of income and wealth taxes can lead to marginal tax rates that are in excess of 100%. You can't tell me that's not going to have an impact on wealth creation, on production. We live in a global economy, and countries have to be competitive about attracting foreign talent and foreign business investment, especially now that you've got the whole movement to work from home. And so many people can work remotely, digital nomadry, and geographical arbitrage. There's people are less tied to their home country than ever before. Of course, the wealth tax is a form of double taxation. People already for their paid taxes on their income, on their capital gains. And if the government's taking, 2 or 3% of wealth every year after year after year, isn't that just going to end up with the state owning everything? And Gary Economics goes on to say, he only wants to tax the super rich, the guys with 100 million, a billion pounds. And maybe that's true. But when the income tax was first introduced, it was only supposed to be on the salaries of people that were making a ton of money back then. And today, almost everybody who earns an income pays income tax. The personal exemption rate is only $15,000. Even a full-time minimum wage worker is going to pay some income tax. Anyway, the problem isn't that the government doesn't tax enough. The government taxes too much already. That's the problem. You also have to understand that there isn't some fixed pie of wealth. The economy is a positive sum game. Wealth is produced. Just because somebody has $1 billion doesn't mean they took your money. That's not how it works. Not if they got their wealth through the market economy. If they enrich themselves through the state, then yes, one group benefits only at the expense of another. But in the market economy, wealth is created through production. So one group creating wealth does not negatively affect anybody else. But Gary doesn't seem to understand that the economy is a positive sum game. Have a listen.
That over time, inequality will get bigger and bigger. And the consequences of that are ordinary people losing their homes and living standards getting worse for ordinary people. We need to get tax rises for the rich. It's not about income taxes, it's about wealth tax.
So this is very typical of leftist thought, where they believe that there's a class war, that the rich get rich at the expense of the poor. And in the market economy, that's not the case. In the market economy, people work side by side on mutually beneficial projects. They make mutually beneficial exchanges. So interactions in the market economy are win-win. You don't hurt anybody else. You just make mutually beneficial exchanges. That's what it is throughout the entire system. Now, once the state enters the equation, it's a different story. Then you have predation. Then you have exploitation. You have one group benefiting at the expense of another. But if some industrialist or businessman gets rich, that's not going to come at the expense of anybody else. That's not going to cause anybody to lose their home. It's certainly not going to cause living standards to fall. Far from it. In a pure free market economy, historically, living standards for the poor as well as everybody else have risen dramatically. And even under the modern system, mixed market economy, liberal Western democracy, highly interventionist state, whatever you want to call it, for all its flaws, living standards have continued to rise in spite of high levels of government spending, high taxes, and inflation that have slowed the rise in living standards, or even maybe stagnated them. But living standards aren't collapsing, as Gary likes to claim. There's absolutely no empirical evidence to support that claim. All right, that's my video. I just wanted to address some of the preposterous and wildly inaccurate claims made by Gary Economics and this other guy. Austerity is a subject that there's a lot of misinformation surrounding, and I wanted to clear the air. Now you know what's up. Zach out.